He tried to confess something to Alexander Yakovlevich, and repent at least for the cruel, mischievous thoughts that he had fleetingly had concerning the unpleasant surprise he was preparing for him with his book, and suddenly he recalled a vulgar triviality. How Shigulov had once said in some connection or other, "When good friends of mine die, I always think that up there they will do something to improve my destiny here. Ho, ho, ho." He was in a troubled and obscured state of mind which was incomprehensible to him, just as everything was incomprehensible, from the sky to that yellow tram rumbling along the clear track of the Hohenzollern, along which Yasha had once gone to his death. But gradually his annoyance with himself passed, and with a kind of relief, as if responsibility for his soul belonged not to him but to someone who knew what it all meant, he felt that all this skein of random thoughts, like everything else as well, the seams and sleaziness of the spring day, the ruffle in the air, the coarse, variously intercrossing threads of confused sounds, was but the reverse side of a magnificent fabric, on the front of which there gradually formed and became alive images invisible to him. He found himself by the bronze boxers. In the flower beds around them rippled pale black blotched pansies, somewhat similar facially to the Charlie Chaplin. He sat on a bench, and where once or twice at night he had sat with Zina, for of late a kind of restlessness had carried him far beyond the bounds of the dark, quiet lane where they had first sought shelter. Nearby a woman sat knitting, next to her a small child entirely clothed in light blue wool, knitting above the pom-pom of a cap and below in foot-straps, was ironing the bench with a toy tank. Sparrows twittered in the bushes, and from time to time made concentrated raids on the turf, on the statues. A sticky smell came from the poplar buds, and far beyond the square the domed crematorium now had stated clean-clicked look. From a distance Fedor could see tiny figures dispersing. He could even make out someone leading Alexandra Yakovlevna to a toy automobile. Tomorrow he would have to call on her, and a group of her friends gathering at the tram stop. He saw them concealed for a moment by the immobilized tram, and then with legerdemain magic they were gone when the shutter was removed. Fedor was about to walk home when a lisping voice called him from behind. It belonged to Shirin, author of the novel The Hoary Abyss, with an epigraph from the Book of Job, which had been received very sympathetically by the emigre critics. "O Lord our Father," down Broadway in a feverish rustle of dollars, hetaras and businessmen in spats, shoving, falling, and out of breath, were running after the golden calf, which pushed its way, rubbing against the walls between the skyscrapers, then turned its emaciated face to the electric sky and howled. And Paris, in a low-class dive, the old man Lachaise, who had once been an aviation pioneer, was now a decrepit vagabond, trampled under his boots, an ancient prostitute, boule de souffle. Oh Lord, why? Out of a Moscow basement a killer came out, squatted by a kennel, and began to coax a shaggy pup. "Little one," he repeated, "little one." And London lords and ladies danced the jimmy and imbibed cocktails, glancing from time to time at a platform where at the end of the 18th ring a huge had laid his fair-haired opponent on the carpet with a knockout. Amid Arctic snows, the explorer Ericsson sat on an empty soapbox and thought gloomily. The pole or not the pole? Ivan Shuryakov carefully trimmed the fringe of his only pair of pants. "O Lord, why dost thou permit all this?" Shirin himself was a thick-set man with a reddish crew-cut, always badly shaved, and wearing large spectacles behind which, as in two aquariums, swam two tiny transparent eyes which were completely impervious to visual impressions. He was blind like Milton, deaf like Beethoven, and a blockhead to boot. A blissful incapacity for observation, and hence complete uniformedness about the surrounding world, and a complete inability to put a name to anything, is a quality quite frequently met with among the average Russian literati, as if in a beneficent fate were at work refusing the blessing of sensory cognition to the untalented so that they will not wantonly mess up the material. It happens, of course, that such a benighted person has some lamp of his own glimmering inside him, not to speak of those known instances in which, through the caprice of resourceful nature, that loves startling adjustments and substitutions, such an inner light is astonishingly bright, enough to make the envy of the readiest talent. But even Dostoevsky always brings to mind somehow a room in which a lamp burns during the day. As he walked now across the park with Shirin, Fedor derived disinterested pleasure from the amusing thought that he had for companion a deaf and blind man with blocked nostrils, who regarded the state with complete indifference, although he was not averse to times to sighing naively about the intellectual's alienation from nature. Recently, Lishnevsky had related that Sheeran had arranged to meet him about some business in the zoological garden. And when, after an hour's conversation, Lishnevsky had casually drawn his attention to a hyena in his cage, it transpired that Sheeran had hardly realized that one keeps animals in a zoological garden, and glancing briefly at the cage had remarked automatically, "Yes, the likes of us don't know much about the animal world," and immediately continued discussing that which particularly disturbed him in life, the activities and composition of the Committee of the Society of Russian Writers in Germany, and now he was in an extreme degree of agitation since a certain event had come to a head. Chairman of the committee was Georgy Ivanovich Vasilev, and for this, of course, there were good reasons: his pre-Soviet reputation, his many years of editorial activity, and most important, that inexorable, almost awesome honesty for which his name was famous. On the other hand, his bad temper, polemical harshness, and despite great public experience, complete ignorance of people not only did not harm his honesty, but on the contrary, imparted a certain tang to it. Sheeran's dissatisfaction was directed not against him, but against the 5 remaining members of the committee. First, because not one of them, as 2/3 incidentally of the whole membership of the society, was a professional writer, and secondly, because 3 of them, including the treasurer and the vice president, were, if not scoundrels, at a partial. Sheeran maintained that at least shade lovers in their bashful but deft activities, for some time past now, a rather comical, in Fedor's opinion, and absolutely outrageous in Sheeran's terminology, affair had been going on with the union's funds. Every time a member asked for a loan or a grant, the difference between which there was about the same as that between a 99-year lease and life ownership, one had to track down these funds, which at least attempt to catch up with them, became amazingly fluid and ethereal, as if they were always situated equidistantly between 3 points represented by the treasurer and 2 members of the committee. The chase was complicated by the fact that for a long time now, Vasilev had not been on speaking terms with these 3 members, refusing even to communicate with them in writing, and in recent times had been dispensing loans and grants of his own pocket, lending others the money for the union to repay him. In the end, the money would be extracted in dribs and drabs, but then it usually turned out that the treasurer had borrowed it from some outsider, so that transactions never caused any change in the phantasmal state of the exchequer. Lately, members of the society who appealed particularly often for the aid had begun to grow visibly nervous. A general meeting had been called for next month, and Sheeran had prepared for it a plan of resolute action. There was a time, he said, striding down a path in the park with Fedor and automatically following its cunningly unobtrusive convolutions, there was a time when all the people who went on the committee of the union were highly respectable, like Potyagin, Ivan Luzhin, Zilanov, but some died and others are in Paris. Somehow Gurman oozed through into it, and then gradually pulled his pals in. For this trio, the passive participation of the extremely decent, I'm saying nothing but completely inert Kern and Goryanov, is a convenient cover, a kind of camouflage. And Gurman's restrained relations with Grigory Ivanovich is a guarantee of inactivity on his part also. The ones to blame for all this are us, the members of the union. If it were not for the idleness, carelessness, lack of organization, indifferent attitude to the union, and flagrant impracticality and social work, it would never have happened that Gurman and his chums for year to year elected either themselves or else people congenial to them. It is time to put an end to this. Their list will be circulated at the coming elections, but we will then put out our own 100% professional President Vasilev, Vice President Getz, members of the board, Lishnevsky, Shamatov, Vladimirov, you and I, and then we'll reconstitute the inspection committee, the more so since Belinky and Chernyshevsky have dropped out. Oh no, please, said Fedor, admiring and passing Sheeran's definition of death. Don't count on me. I never went and never will go to any committee. Stop it, exclaimed Sheeran, frowning. That's not fair. On the contrary, very fair, and anyway, if I am a member of the union, it's only out of absent-mindedness. To tell the truth, Konchiev is right to stand aside from all this. Konchiev, said Sheeran angrily. Konchiev is an absolutely useless handicraftsman, working on his own and is completely devoid of any general interest. But you ought to be interested in the fate of the union, if only because you, excuse my directness, borrow money from it. That's just it. You can see for yourself that I go on the committee. I shan't possibly be able to give handouts to myself. Bosh, why not? It's a completely legal procedure. You will simply get up and go to the lavatory and so become for a moment, so to speak, an ordinary member, while your colleagues discuss your request. All these are empty excuses that you've just thought up. How's your new novel? Asked Fedor. Is it nearly finished? We're not talking about my novel now. I ask you very seriously to give your assent. We need young blood. Lishnevsky and I have given much thought to this list. Under no circumstances, said Fedor. I don't want to play the fool. Well, if you call your public duty playing the fool. If I go on the committee, I shall certainly be playing the fool, so I am refusing precisely out of the respect for duty. Very sad, said Shirin. Will we really have to take Rodislav Strani instead of you? Of course, wonderful, I adored Rodislav. Actually, I'd reserved him for the inspection committee. There's also Bush, of course, but do think it over, please. It's not a trifling matter. We shall have a regular battle with these gangsters. I am preparing a speech that will really make them sit up. Think it over. Do. You still have a whole month. During that month, Fedor's book came out, and 2 or 3 notices had time to appear, so that he set off for the general meeting with the pleasant feeling that he would find more than one enemy reader there. It took place as usual in the upper premises of a large cafe, and when he arrived everybody was already there. A phenomenally dexterous waiter with darting eyes was serving beer and coffee. The members of the society were seated at little tables. The creative writers formed a close-knit group, and one could already hear the energetic psst of Shamatov, who had been served the wrong order. In the back, behind a long table, sat the committee, the bulky, extremely gloomy Vasilev, with Goryanov and engineer Kern on his right, and the 3 others on his left. Kern, whose main interest was turbines, but who had once been on friendly terms with Alexander Blok, and the former official of the former government department, Goryanov, who could recite marvelously woe from wit, as well as Ivan the Terrible's dialogue for the Lithuanian ambassador when he used to do a splendid imitation of a Polish accent, bore themselves with quiet distinction. They had betrayed long ago their 3 unrighteous colleagues, of coffee-colored birthmark, massive sloping shoulders, and a disdainfully offended expression on his thick purplish lips. His relationship to literature was limited to a brief and entirely commercial connection with some German publisher of technical guides. The principal theme of his personality, the pith of his existence, was speculation. He was particularly keen on Soviet bills of exchange. Next to him sat a small but sturdily resilient barrister, with a jutting jaw, a rapacious gleam in his right eye. The left one was half closed by nature, and a whole store of metal in his mouth. An alert, fiery man, something of a swashbuckler in his own way, who was always challenging people to arbitration, and he would talk of this. I called him out, he refused, with the precise severity of hardened duelist. Gorman's other friend, loose-fleshed, gray-skinned, languid, wearing horn-rimmed spectacles, his whole aspect resembling a peaceful toad that wants only one thing, to be left in complete peace in a damp place, had somewhere written notes on economic questions, although the evil-tongued Lishnevsky denied him even this, swearing that sole printed effort was a letter in pre-revolution days to the editor of an Odessa newspaper, in which he had indignantly associated himself with a villainous namesake, who subsequently turned out to be his relative, then his double, and finally himself, as if there was in action here the irrevocable law of capillary attraction and fusion. Fedor sat between the novelists Shamanov and Vladimirov by a wide window behind which the night gleamed wetly black. With two-toned, the Berlin imagination did not stretch to any more illuminated signs, ozone blue and arpotur red, and rumbling electric trains with rapidly and distinctly lighted insides gliding above the square along a viaduct, against whose archivolts below slow, grinding trams seemed to keep butting without finding a loophole. Meanwhile, the chairman of the board, who had stood up and proposed the election of a chairman for the meeting, there sounded from various places, Kravich, let's have Kravich, and the Professor Kravich, no relation to the author of the textbook on physics. He was the professor of international law, a mobile, angular old man in a knitted waistcoat and unbuttoned jacket, swept up the president table extraordinarily fast, holding his left hand in his trouser pocket and tossing up his pince-nez on the end of his cord with his right. He sat down between Vasilev and Gurman, who was slowly and gloomily twisting a cigarette into an amber holder, immediately stood up again and pronounced the meeting opened. I wonder, thought Fedor, glancing sideways at Vladimirov, I wonder if he has read my book. Vladimirov put down his glass and looked at Fedor, but he said nothing. Beneath his jacket he was wearing an English sports sweater with a black and orange border along its triangular opening, and the receding hair on either side of his forehead exaggerated his latter's dimensions. His large nose was strongly boned, his grayish-yellow teeth glistened unpleasantly beneath his slightly raised lips, and his eyes looked out with intelligence and indifference. He had studied, it seemed, at an English university and flaunted a pseudo-British manner. At 29 he was already the author of 2 novels, outstanding for the force and swiftness of their mirror-like style, which irritated Fedor perhaps for the very reason that he felt a certain affinity with them. As a conversationalist, Vladimir was singularly unattractive. One blamed him for being derisive, supercilious, cold, incapable of thawing to friendly discussions, but that was also said about Konchiev, and about Fedor himself, and about anyone whose thoughts lived in their own private house and not in a barrack room or a pub. When a secretary had also been elected, Professor Kravich proposed that all should stand to honor the memory of the 2 deceased members of the society, and during this 5-second petrification, the excommunicated waiter scanned the tables, having forgotten who ordered the ham sandwich he had just brought it on the tray. Everyone stood as he could. Gurman, for example, his skewbald head lowered, was holding his palm upwards on the table as if he had just cast the dice and was frozen in astonishment at his loss. "Allo, here!" shouted Shamatov, who had been waiting anxiously for the moment when, with a clatter of relief, life would be seated again, and then the waiter quickly raised his index finger, he had remembered, glided over to him with a tinkle, put the plate down on the imitation marble. Shamatov immediately began to cut the sandwich, holding his knife and fork crosswise. On the edge of the plate a yellow blob of mustard projected, as is usually the case, a yellow horn. Shamatov's complacently Napoleonic face, with its strand of steely blue hair slanting toward the temple, appeared particularly to Fedor at these gastronomic moments. Next to him, drinking tea with lemon, and himself very lemony, with sadly arched eyebrows, sat the satirist from the Gazeta, whose pseudonym, Femme Amour, contained, according to his own assertion, a complete French novel, Femme Amour, a page of English literature, Thomas More, and a touch of Jewish skepticism, Thomas the Apostle. Chiron was sharpening a pencil over an ashtray. He was very much offended at Fedor for refusing to figure in the election list. Of the writers there were also Radoslav Strani, a rather dreadful person with a bracelet on his hairy wrist, the parchment, pale, raven-haired poetist, Anak Apkatar, a theatre critic, a skinny, singularly quiet young man with an elusive something about him recalling a daguerreotype of the Russian Fedor, who with half an ear cocked to the society president's report, had now transferred his gaze from Bush, Leshnevsky, Chiron, and the other writers to the general mass of those present, among whom were several journalists, as for instance old Stupashin, whose spoon was working its way through a wedge of mocha cake, many reporters, and sitting alone and admitted here on God knows what basis, Loboyev Markovna and her timorously gleaming pince-nez, and in general there was a large number of those whom Chiron severely termed the outside element, the imposing lawyer Charsky, holding his 4th cigarette of the night in his white, always trembling hand, a bearded little jobber who had once published an obituary notice in a Buddhist paper, a gentle, pale old man tasting of apple paste, who enthusiastically discharged his duties as precentor of the church choir, an enormous, enigmatic fat man who lived as a hermit in a pine wood near Berlin, some said in a cave, and had there compiled a collection of Soviet anecdotes, a separate group of rowdies, conceited failures, a pleasant young man of unknown means and position, a Soviet agent, said Chiron simply and darkly, another lady, someone's former secretary, her husband, the brother of a well-known publisher, and all these people, from the illiterate bum with a heavy drunken gaze, who wrote denunciatorily mystical verses which not a single newspaper had yet agreed to publish, to the repulsively small, almost portable lawyer, Poshkin, who when talking to people said "I pot" for "I put," and "Koshin" for "cushion," as if establishing an alibi for his name. All of these, in Chiron's opinion, damaged the society's dignity and were liable to immediate expulsion. "And now," said Valisev, after finishing his report, "I bring to the notice of the meeting that I resign as chairman of the society and will not stand for re-election." He sat down. A little chill ran through the assembly. Beneath the burden of snow, Gurman closed his heavy lids. An electric train slid bow-like over a bowstring. "Next comes," said Professor Kravich, raising his pince-nez to his eyes and looking at the agenda, "the treasurer's report, if you please." Gurman's resilient neighbor, immediately adopting a challenging tone of voice, flashing his good eye and powerfully twisting his valuable crammed mouth, commenced to read. Figures were emitted like sparks, metallic words bounced, entered the current year, debited, audited, while Chiron, in the meantime, swiftly began to note something on the reverse side of a cigarette pack, added it up, and triumphantly exchanged glances with Leshnevsky. Having read to the end, the treasurer shut his mouth with a click. With some distance off, a member of the auditorial committee had already risen, a Georgian socialist, and a pockmarked face and black hair like a shoe brush. and briefly enumerated his favorable impressions. After this, Sheeran asked for the floor, and at once there was a whiff of something jolly, alarming, and improper. He began by seizing the fact that the expenditure for the New Year's charity dance was inexplicably large. Gurman wanted to reply. The chairman, aiming his pencil at Sheeran, asked him if he had finished. "Let him speak, no cutting short," shouted Shamatov from his seat, and the chairman's pencil, quivering like a serpent's tongue, was aimed at him before returning to Sheeran, who, however, bowed and sat down. Gurman rose heavily, carrying his sorrowful burden with disdain and resignation, and began to speak, but Sheeran soon interrupted him, and Kravitz grasped his bell. Gurman finished, after which the treasurer instantly asked for the floor, and Sheeran was already up and continuing. "The explanation for the honorable gentleman from the Stock Exchange." The chairman rang his bell, and I requested more moderation. Threatening to refuse permission to speak, Sheeran again bowed and said that he had only one question. "In the funds, according to the treasurer's words, there are 3,076 marks and 15 pfennigs. Could he see his money right now?" "Bravo!" shouted Shamatov, and the least attentive member of the union, the mystical poet, guffawed, applauded, and almost fell off his chair. The treasurer, paling to a snowy shine, began to squeak in a rapid patter. While he was speaking, and being interrupted by impossible exclamations from the audience, a certain Shuf, lean, clean-shaven, looking somewhat like a red Indian, left his corner, went up to the committee table unnoticed on his rubber soles, and suddenly slammed his red fist down on it so that even the bell gave a jump. "You're lying," he bellowed, and returned to his seat. A row was breaking out on all sides when, to Sheeran's chagrin, it transpired that there was yet another faction wishing to seize power, namely the group that was always left out, and that included both the mystic and the red Indian, as well as the little bearded fellow and the several seedy and unbalanced individuals, one of whom suddenly began to read from the pieces of paper a list of candidates for election to the committee, all of whom were completely unacceptable. The battle took a new turn, sufficiently tangled now that there were three warring sides. Such expressions flew about as "black marketeer," "you're not fit to duel," and "you've already been thrashed." Even Bush spoke, trying to drown insulting ejaculations, but because of the natural obscurity of his style, no one could understand what he was talking about until, sitting down, he explained that he was fully in agreement with the preceding speaker. Gurman, his nostrils alone expressing sarcasm, busied himself with a cigarette holder. Vasilev left his seat and retired to a corner where he pretended to read a newspaper. Lishnevsky delivered a crushing speech directed mainly against the board member resembling a peaceful toad, who merely spread his hands and directed a helpless glance at Gurman, the treasurer, both of whom tried not to look at him. Finally, when the poet mystic stood up, shakily swaying, and with a highly promising smile on his sweaty, leathery face began to speak in verse, the chairman furiously rang his bell and announced an interval, after which the elections were due to be held. Sheeran flew over to Vasilev and commenced to talk to him persuasively, while Fedor, feeling suddenly bored, found his mackintosh and made his way out onto the street. He was angry with himself. Fancy sacrificing, for the sake of this preposterous divertissement, the fixed star of the nightly meeting with Zina. This desire to see her at once tormented with its paradoxical impossibility. If she had not slept 6 yards from the head of his bed, access to her would have been much easier. A train stretched over the viaduct, the yawn begun by a woman, and the lighted window of the first car was completed by another woman in the last one. Fedor Konstantinovitch strolled toward the tram stop along an oily black blaring street. The illuminated sign of a music hall ran up the steps. Of vertically placed letters, they went out altogether, and the light again scrambled up. What Babylonian word would reach up into the sky? A compound name for a trillion tints. Diamond dim, luna lilis, lilas, sapphire violet, and so on, and how many more? Perhaps he should try to phone? He only had a dime in his pocket, and he had to decide. To phone meant that in any case he would not be able to make the tram, but to phone for nothing, that is to get Zina herself, to get through to her mother, was not permitted by the code, and then to return on foot would be a bit too galling. I'll risk it. He went into a beer house, rang, and everything was over in a twinkle. He got the wrong number, that very number which the anonymous Russian was always trying to get, and who always got the Shkolevs. So what? He would have to hoof it, as Boris Ivanovich would say. At the next corner, his approach automatically triggered off the doll-like mechanisms of the prostitutes who always patrolled there. One of them even tried to look like somebody lingered by a shop window, and it was sad to think that these pink corsets on their golden dummies were known to her by heart. By heart, sweetie, said another with a questioning smile. The night was warm with a dusting of stars. He walked at a swift pace, and bared head felt light from the narcotic night air, and further on, when he walked along the gardens, and there came floating to him phantoms of lilacs, the darkness of foliage, and wonderful naked odors spreading on the lawns. He was hot, and his forehead was burning, when finally, quietly clicking the door shut behind him, he found himself in the dark hall. The opaque glass in the upper part of Zena's door resembled a radiant sea. She must be reading in bed, he thought. But while he stood and looked at this mysterious glass, she coughed, rustled, and the light went out. What an obscured torture! Go in there, go in. Who would know? People like her mother and stepfather sleep with insensible 100% sleep of peasants. Zena's punctiliousness, she would never open the clinking tap of a fingernail. But she knows I am standing in the dark hall and suffocating. This forbidden room during recent months had become a sickness, a burden, a part of himself, but inflated and sealed off, a pneumatic thorax of the night. He stood for another moment, and on tiptoe stole into his room. All in all, French emotions, femme amour. Sleep, sleep, the heaviness of spring is utterly untalented. Take oneself in hand, a monastic pun. What's next? What exactly are we waiting for? In any case, I won't find a better wife. But do I need a wife at all? Put that lyre away. I've no room to move. No, I would never hear that from her. That's the point. And a few days later, simply and somewhat even sillily, a solution was indicated to a problem which seemed so complex that one could not help wondering if there was not a mistake in its construction. Boris Ivanovich, whose affairs during recent years had been getting worse and worse, was most unexpectedly offered by a Berlin firm quite a respectable representative's position in Copenhagen. In 2 months, by the 1st of July, he had to move there for at least a year and perhaps forever if all went well. Mariana Nikolaevna, who for some reason loved Berlin, familiar haunts, excellent sanitary arrangements, she herself was filthy, felt sad at going away, but then she thought of the improvements in life awaiting her. Her grief was dispersed. Thus it was decided that from July Zina would remain alone in Berlin, continuing to work for Traum until Shigolev had found her a job in Copenhagen, where Zina would go at the first summons, i.e. that is what the Shigolevs thought. Zina had decided quite differently. It remained to regulate the question of the apartment. The Shigolevs did not want to sell it, so they began to seek somebody to let it to. They found such a person, a young German with a great commercial future, accompanied by his fiancée, a plain, unmade-up, domestically sturdy girl in a green coat, inspected by the apartment. Dining room, bedroom, kitchen, fedora, and bed, and was satisfied. However, he was taking the apartment only from August, so that for another month until after the Shigolevs' departure, Zina and the lodger would be able to stay there. They counted the days, 50, 49, 30, 25, every one of these numbers had its own face, a beehive, a magpie in a tree, the silhouette of a knight, a young man. Their evening meetings had since spring gone beyond the shores of their initial street, lamp, line, fence, and now their restless wanderings carried them in ever-widening circles into distant and ever-new corners of the city. Now it was a bridge over a canal, then a trellised bosquet in the park, behind which lights ran past, then an unpaved street between misty wastes where dark vans were standing, then some strange arcades which were impossible to find during the daytime. Change of habits before migration, excitement, a languorous pain in the shoulders. The newspapers diagnosed the still young summer as being exceptionally hot, and indeed there was a long-dotted line of beautiful days interrupted from time to time by the interjection of a thunderstorm. In the morning, while Zina was wilting from the sinking heat in the office, the sweaty armpits of Hamek's jacket alone were more than enough. And what about the typist's necks melting like wax, and about the sticky blackness of the carbon paper? Fedor would go to spend the whole day at Grunwald, abandoning his lessons and trying not to think of this long since due payment for his room. Never before had he got up to 7. It would have seemed monstrous, but now in life's new light, in which blended somehow with the maturing of his gift, a premonition of new labors, and the approach of complete happiness with Zina, he experienced a direct pleasure from the speed and lightness of these early risings, from that burst of motion, from the ideal simplicity of 3-second dressing, shirt, trousers, and sneakers on bare feet, after which he took a lap robe under his arm, and his swim trunks wrapped in it, thrust on his way through the hall, an orange and a sandwich into his pockets, and was already running down the stairs. A turned-back doormat held the door in a wide-open position, which the janitor energetically beat the dust out of another mat by slapping it against the trunk of an innocent lime tree. What have I done to deserve this? The asphalt was still in the dark blue shadow of the houses. On the sidewalk gleamed the first fresh excrements of a dog. A black hearse, which yesterday had been standing outside a repair shop, rolled cautiously out of a gate and turned down the empty street, and inside it, behind the glass and among artificial white roses, in place of a coffin, lay a bicycle. Whose? Why? The dairy was already open, but the lazy tobacconist was still asleep. The sun played on various objects along the right side of the street, like a magpie picking out the tiny things that glittered. At the end of it, when it crossed by the wide ravine of the railroad, a cloud-moke of steam suddenly appeared, from the right of the bridge, disintegrated against its iron ribs, then immediately loomed white again on the other side, and Waverley streamed away from the gaps in the trees. Crossing the bridge after this, Fedora, as usual, was gladdened by the wonderful poetry of railroad banks, by their free and diversified nature, a growth of locusts and swallows, wild grass, bees, butterflies. All this lived in isolation and unconcerned in the harsh vicinity of coal dust glistening below, between the 5 streams of rails, and in blissful estrangement from the city colossus above, from the peeled walls of old houses toasting their tattooed backs in the morning sunshine. Beyond the bridge, near the small public garden, 2 elderly postal workers, having completed their check of a stamp machine and grown suddenly playful, were stealing up behind the jasmine, one behind the other, and imitating each other's gestures toward a third, who with eyes closed was humbly and briefly relaxing on a bench before his working day in order to tickle his nose with a flower. Where shall I put all these gifts with which the summer morning rewards me, and only me? Save them up for future books? Use them immediately for a practical handbook, how to be happy? Or, getting deeper to the bottom of things, understand what is concealed behind all this, behind the play, the sparkle of the thick, the green grease paint of the foliage? For there really is something, and one wants to offer thanks, but there is no one to thank. The list of donations already made, 10,000 days from person unknown. He walked farther, past iron railings, past the deep gardens of bankers' villas with their grotto shadows, boxwood, ivy, and lawns, pearled with watering. There, among the elms and limes, the first pines already appeared, sent out far ahead by the Grunwald pine woods, or on the contrary, stragglers behind the regiment, whistling loudly and rising uphill. On the pedals of his 3-wheeled bicycle, a baker's roundsman went by. A water spray crawled slowly by with a wet, hissing sound, a wheel on wheels, generously irrigating the asphalt. Someone with a briefcase slammed a vermilion-painted garden gate and set off for some unknown office. Fedora emerged on his heels onto the boulevard, still the same Hohenzollerdom, at whose beginning they burned poor Alexander Yakovlevich, and there, its lock flashing, the briefcase ran for a tram. Now it was not far to the forest, and quickened his step, already feeling the sun's hot mask on his upturned face. The pickets from the fence flicked by, speckling his vision. On yesterday's vacant lot, a small villa was being built, and since the sky was looking in through the gaps of the future windows, and since burdocks in sunlight had taken advantage of the slowness of the work to make themselves comfortable within the unfinished white walls, these had acquired the pensive cast of ruins, like the word sometime, which serves both the past and the future. Toward the door came a young girl in a bottle of milk. She bore some resemblance to Zena, or rather contained a particle of that fascination, both special and vague, which he found in many girls, but with particular fullness in Zena, so that they all possessed some mysterious kinship with Zena, about which he alone knew, although he was completely incapable of formulating the indicia of his kinship, outside of which women evoked painful disgust in him. And now, as he looked back at her and caught her long-familiar golden fugitive outline that promptly vanished forever, he felt for a moment the impact of a hopeless desire, whose whole charm and richness was in its unquenchability. Oh, trite demon of cheap thrills, do not tempt me with the catchword, my type. Not that, but something beyond that. Definition is always finite. But I keep straining for the far away. I search beyond the barricades of words, of senses, of the world, for infinity, where all of the lines meet. At the end of the boulevard, the green edge of the pine wood came into sight, with a gaudy portico of a recently constructed pavilion, in whose atrium was to be found an assortment of restrooms, men's, women's, and children's, through which, according to the scheme of local Lenotres, one had to go in order to enter at first a newly laid-out rock garden, with alpine flora along geometric paths, which served, still according to that same scheme, as a pleasant threshold to the forest. But Fedor turned to the left, avoiding the threshold. It was nearer that way. The still wild edge of the pine wood stretched endlessly along an avenue for automobiles, and the next step of the part of the city fathers was inevitable, fence the wild of this free access with endless railings, so that the portico became the entrance of necessity in the most literal elementary sense. I built this ornamental thing for you, but you weren't attacked. So now, if you please, it is ornamental and regimental, but by a mental jump back again, F3GL. It could hardly have been better with this forest, now retreated, now crowded around the lake, and like us, in our own departure from hairy ancestors, having kept only a marginal vegetation used to stretch by the very heart of the present city, and a noisy princely rabble galloped along its wilds with thorns and hounds beaters. The forest, I found it was still alive, rich, full of birds. There occurred orioles, pigeons, and jays. A crow flew by, its wings panting. Kshoo, 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 a red-headed woodpecker was rapping against a pine trunk, and sometimes, I presume, imitating its own rap vocally, whereupon it came out particularly loud and convincingly for the female's benefit, for there was nothing in nature more bewitchingly divine than her ingenious deceptions cropping up in unexpected places. Thus a forest grasshopper, starting his little motor but never able to get it going, sick, 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 and breaks off. Having jumped and landed, immediately readjusts the position of his body by turning in such a way as to make the direction of his dark stripes coincide with those of the fallen needles, or with their shadows. But be careful. I like to recall what my father wrote. When closely, no matter how closely, observing the events in nature, we must, in the very process of observation, beware of letting our reason, that garrulous dragoman, who always runs ahead, prompt up with explanations which then begin imperceptibly to influence the very course of observation and distort it. Thus the shadow of the instrument falls upon the truth. Give me your hand, dear reader, and let's go into the forest together. Look first at these glades with patches of thistle, nettle, or willow herb, among which you will find all kinds of junk, sometimes even a ragged mattress with rusty broken springs. Don't disdain it. Here is a dark thicket of small firs where I once discovered a pit, which had been carefully dug out before its death by the creature that had laid therein. A young slender-muzzled dog of wolf ancestry folded into a wonderfully graceful curve, paws to paws, and now come bare hillocks with no undergrowth, merely a carpet of brown needles beneath simplistic pines, which have a hammock stretched between them, full of someone's unexacting body, and the wire skeleton of a discarded lampshade is also here, lying on the ground. Further we have a barren surrounded by locust trees, and there on the grey burning sticky sand sits a woman in underwear, her dreadful bare legs stretched out, and darns a stocking, while beside her crawls a child dark-groined for the dust. You can still see from here the thoroughfare and the sparkle of automobile radiators skimming by, but you have only to penetrate a little deeper, and the forest reasserts itself, the pines become nobler, moss creaks underfoot, and some bum is invariably asleep here, a newspaper covering his face. The philosopher prefers moss to roses. Here is the exact spot where a small airplane fell the other day. Someone who was taking his girl for a morning ride in the blue got over exuberant, lost control of his joystick, and plunged with a screech and a crackle straight into the pines. I, unfortunately, came too late. They had time to clear up the wreckage, and two mounted policemen were riding at a walk toward the road, but one could still see the imprint of the daring death beneath the pines, one of which had been shaved from top to bottom by a wing, and the architect, Stocksmeiser, walking with his dog, was explaining to a nurse and a child what had happened. But a few days later all traces had disappeared. There was only the yellow wound on the pine tree, and already in complete ignorance of the old man and his old woman, facing each other, she in her bodice and he in his underpants, were doing uncomplicated gymnastics on the same spot. Farther on it became very nice. The pines had come into their own, and between their pinkish, scaly trunks the feathery foliage of low rowans and the vigorous greenery of oaks broke the stripiness of the pine-wood sun into an animated dapple. In the density of an oak, when you looked from below, the overlapping of shaded, illumined leaves, dark green and bright emerald, seemed to be a jigsaw fitting together of their wavy edges, and on these leaves, now letting the sun caress its yellow-brown silk, and now tightly closing its wings, then settled the angle-wing butterfly, with a bright bracket on its dark-mottled underside. Suddenly taking off, it alighted on my bare chest, attracted by human sweat, and still higher above my upturned face, the summits and trunks of the pines participated in a complex exchange of shadows, and their leafage reminded me of algae swaying in transparent water, and if I tilted my head back even further, so that the grass behind, inexpressibly, primevally green from this point of upturned vision, seemed to be growing downward into empty transparent light, I experienced something similar to what must strike a man who has flown to another planet, with a different gravity, different density, and a different stress on the senses, especially when a family out for a stroll went by upside down, with every step they took becoming a strange elastic jerk, and a lobbed ball seemed to be falling ever more slowly into a dizzy abyss. If one advanced even further, not to the left when the pine wood stretched endlessly, and not to the right where it was interrupted by coppices of young birches, freshly and childishly smelling of Russia, the forest again thinned out, lost its undergrowth, and struggled down sandy inclines at the foot which broad lake rose in pillars of light. The sun changefully illuminated the opposite bank, and when the one set of the cloud the very air seemed to close, like a great blue eye, and then slowly open again, one shore always lagged behind the other in the process of gradually fading and lighting up. There was practically no sandy border on the lake other side, and the trees descended altogether to the dense reeds, while higher up one could find hot, dry slopes overgrown with clover, sorrel, and spurge, fringed with the rich dark green of oaks and beeches, that went tumbling down to the damp hollows below, in one of which Yasha Chernyshevsky had shot himself. When in the mornings I entered this world of the forest, whose image I had raised, as it were, by my own efforts above the level of those artless Sunday impressions, paper trash, a crowd of picnickers, out of which the Berliner's conception of Grunwald was composed, when on these hot summer weekdays I walked over to its southern side, into its depths, to wild secret spots, I felt as much delight as if this was a primeval paradise within 2 miles from the Agamemnonstrasse. Coming to a favorite nook of mine, which magically combined a free flow of sunshine with protection by the shrubbery, I stripped to the skin and lied down supine on the rug, placing my unnecessary trunks beneath my head. Thanks to the suntan coating my entire body so that only my heels, palms, and ray-like lines around my eyes kept their natural tint, I felt myself an athlete, a Tarzan, an Adam, anything you like, only that a naked town dweller. The awkwardness which nakedness is usually accompanied depends on the awareness of our defenseless whiteness, which has long since lost all connection with the colors of the surrounding world, and for that reason finds itself in artificial disharmony with it. But the sun's impact restores the deficiency, makes us equal in our naked rights with nature, and the brazen body no longer experiences shame. All this sounds like a nudist brochure, but one's own truth is not to blame if it coincides with the truth some poor fellow has borrowed. The sun bore down, the sun licked me all over with its big smooth tongue. I gradually felt that I was becoming moltenly transparent, that I was permeated with flame, existed only insofar as it did. As a book it translated into exotic idiom, so as I translated into sun, the scrawny, chilly Heimel Fedor Gudanov Sherdentsev, who now is remote from me as if I had exiled him to a Yakutsk province. He was pallid copy of me, whereas this estival one was a magnified bronze replica, my personal I, the one that wrote books, the one that loved words, colors, mental fireworks, Russia, chocolate, and Xena, had somehow disintegrated and dissolved after being made transparent by the strength of the light. It was now assimilated to the shimmering of the summer forest, with its satiny pine needles and heavenly green leaves, with its ants running over the transfigured, most radiant-hued wool of the laprobe, with its birds, smells, hot breath, and nettles of spermy odor of sun-warmed grass, with its blue sky where droned a high-flying plane, the scene filmed over with blue dust, the blue essence of the firmament. The plane was bluish as a fish is wet in water. One might dissolve completely that way. Fedor raised himself and sat up. A streamlet of sweat flowed down his clean-shaven chest and fell into the reservoir of his navel. His flat belly had a brown and mother-of-pearl sheen to it. Over the glistening black ringlets of his hair, a lost ant scrambled nervously. His shins shone glossy. Pine needles had got stuck between his toes. With his bathing trunks he wiped his short-cropped head, sticky nape, and neck. A squirrel with an arched back loped across the turf from tree to tree in a wavy, almost clumsy course. The scrub oaks, elder shrubs, pine trunks, everything was dazzlingly spotted, and a small cloud, in no way defiling the face of the summer day, felt its way slowly past the sun. He got up, took a step, and immediately the weightless pall of a leafy shadow descended upon his left shoulder. It slipped off again at the next step. Fedor consulted the position of the sun and dragged his rug a yard or so aside to prevent the shade of the leaves from encroaching upon him. To move around naked was astonishing bliss. The freedom around his loins was especially pleased him. He walked between the bushes, listening to the vibration of insects and the rustling of the birds. A wren crept like a mouse through the foliage of a small oak. A sand wasp flew by low down, carrying a benumbed caterpillar. The squirrel he had just seen climbed up the bark of a tree with a spasmodic, scribbly sound. Somewhere in the vicinity sounded girlish voices, and he stopped at a pattern of shadow, which stayed motionless along his arm, but palpitated rhythmically on his left side between the ribs. A golden, stumpy little butterfly, equipped with 2 black commas, alighted on an oak leaf, half opening its slanting wings, and suddenly shot away like a golden fly. And as often happened on these woodland days, especially when he glimpsed familiar butterflies, Fedor imagined his father's isolation in other forests, gigantic, infinitely distant, in comparison with which this one was but brushwood, a tree stump, rubbish, and yet he experienced something akin to that Asiatic freedom, spreading wide on the maps, to the spirit of his father's peregrinations. And here it was most difficult of all to believe that despite the freedom, despite the greenery and the happy, sun-shot dark shade, his father was none the less dead. The voices sounded closer than needed. A horsefly that had settled unnoticed on his thigh managed to jab him with its blunt proboscis. Moss, turf, sand, each in its own way, communicated with the soles of his bare feet, and each in its own way the sun and the shade stroked the hot silk of his body. His senses, sharpened by the unrestricted heat, were tantalized by the possibility of sylvan encounters, mythical abductions. Le sanglot dont j'étais encore ivre. He would have given a year of his life, even a leap year, for Zena to be here, or any of her corpse de ballet. He again lay flat and again got up. With a beating heart he listened to sly, vaguely promising noises, then pulling on only his trunks and hiding lap-robe and clothes under a bush, he went off to wander through the woods around the lake. Here and there, thinly on weekdays, there occurred more or less orange bodies. He avoided looking closely for fear of switching from pan to punch, but sometimes next to a school satchel and beside her shiny bicycle propped up against a tree trunk, a lone nymph would sprawl, her legs bared to the crotch and swayed soft to the eye, and her elbows thrown back and her hair and her armpits glistening in the sun. Temptation's arrow had hardly had time to sing out and pierce him before he noticed, a short distance away at 3 equidistant points, forming a magic triangle around whose prize the strangers to one another, 3 motionless hunters, visible in between tree trunks. 2 young fellows, one lying prone, the other on his side, and an elderly man, coatless, with armbands in his shirt sleeves, sitting solidly on the grass, motionless and eternal, with sad but patient eyes. And it seemed that these 3 pairs of eyes, striking the same spot, would finally, with the help of the sun, burn a hole in the black bathing tights of our poor little German girl, who never raised her ointment-smeared lids. He descended to the sandy shore of the lake, and here in the roar of voices the charmed fabric which he himself had so carefully spun completely fell to pieces. He saw with revulsion the crumpled, twisted, deformed by life's nor'easter, more or less naked or more or less clothed. The latter were the more terrible bodies of the bathers, pretty bourgeois idle workers, stirring on the dirty grey sand. At the point where the shore road went along the lake's narrow lip, the latter was fenced off by stakes, supporting tortured-looking remnants of sagging wire, and the place by these stakes was particularly valued by the beach habitués, partly because trousers could be conveniently hung by their suspenders on them, while underwear was laid on the dusty nettles, and partly because of the vague feeling of security from having a fence at one's back. Old men's grey legs, covered with growths of swollen veins, flat feet, the tawny crust of corns, pink porcine paunches, wet, shivering, pale, hoarse-voiced adolescents, the globes of breasts, voluminous posteriors, flabby thighs, bluish varices, goose-flesh, the pimply shoulder blades of brandy-legged girls, the sturdy necks and buttocks of muscular hooligans, the hopeless, godless vacancy of satisfied faces, romps, guffaws, roisterous splashing, all this formed the apotheosis of that renowned German good-naturedness which can turn so easily at any moment into frenzied hooting. Over all this, especially on Sundays, when the crowding was vilest of all, there reigned an unforgettable smell, the smell of dust, of sweat, of aquatic slime, of unclean underwear, of arid and dried poverty, the smell of dried, smoked, potted souls, a penny of a price. But the lake itself, with vivid green clumps of trees on the other side, and a rippling wake of sunshine in the middle, bore itself with dignity. Having selected a private little creek among the bulrushes, Fedor took to the water. Its warm opacity enveloped him. Sparks of sunshine danced before his eyes. He swam for a long time, half an hour, 5 hours, 20 for a week, another. Finally, on the 28th of June, around 3 p.m., he came out on the other shore. Having made his way out of the lakeside spinach, he at once found himself in the grove, and from there he climbed onto a hot slope, where he quickly dried in the sun. On the right was a ravine overgrown with oak brush and bramble, and today, just as every time that he came here, Fedor descended into that hollow which always attracted him, as if he had been somehow guilty of the death of an unknown youth who had shot himself here, precisely here. He reflected that Alexandra Yakovlevna used to come here as well, rummaging purposefully among the bushes with her tiny black-gloved hands. He had not known her then, but could not have seen it from her account of the multiple pilgrimages. He felt it had been exactly like that. The search for something, the rustling of leaves, the prodding umbrella, the radiant eyes, the lips trembling with sobs. He recalled how he had met her this spring, for the last time after her husband's death, and the strange sensation that overwhelmed him when looking at her lowered face with its unworldly frown, as if he had never really seen her before, and was now making out on her face the resemblance to her deceased husband, whose death was expressed on it through some hitherto concealed funeral blood relationship. A day later she went away to some relatives in Riga, and already her face, the stories about her son, the literary evenings at her house, the Alexander Yakovlevich's mental illness, all this had served its time, and now rolled up of its own accord and came to an end like a bundle of life tied up crosswise which will long be kept, but which will never again be untied by our lazy, procrastinating, ungrateful hands. He was seized by a panicky desire to not allow it to close and get lost in a corner of the soul's lumber room, a desire to apply all this to himself, to his eternity, to his truth, so as to enable it to sprout up in a new way. There is a way, the only way. He ascended another slope, and there, at the top of the path which descended again, sitting on a bench beneath an oak tree, and slowly, pensively tracing the sand with his cane, was a round-shouldered young man in a black suit. How hot he must be, thought the naked Fedor. The sitter looked up, the sun turned and slightly raised his face with a photographer's delicate gesture, a bloodless face with wide-set, myopically gray eyes. Between the corners of his starched collar, the type once called in Russia dog's delight, a stud gleamed above the slack knot of his tie. "How sunburned you are," said Kontchev. "It can hardly be good for you, and where, pray, are your clothes?" "Over there," said Fedor, "on the other side, in the woods. Someone might steal them," remarked Kontchev. "It is not for nothing that there's a proverb, free-handed Russian, right-fingered Prussian." Fedor sat down and said, "There is no such proverb. By the way, do you know where we two are? Beyond those blackberry bushes down below is the place where Shereshevsky boy, the poet, shot himself." "Oh, is it here?" said Kontchev, without especial interest. "You know, his Olga recently married a furrier, and went off to the United States. Not quite the Lancer whom Pushkin's Olga married, but still, aren't you hot?" asked Fedor. "Not a bit. I have a weak chest, and I always freeze. But of course, when one sits next to a naked man, one is physically aware that there exists men's outfitters, and one's body feels blind. On the other hand, it seems to me that any mental work must be completely impossible for you in such a denuded state." "A good point," grinned Fedor. "One seems to live more superficially on the surface of one's own skin. That's it. All you're concerned with is patrolling your body and trailing in the sun. But thought likes curtains in the camera obscura. Sunlight is good in the degree that it heightens the value of shade. A jail with no jailer, and a garden with no gardener. That is, I think, the ideal arrangement. Tell me, did you read what I said about your book?" "I did," replied Fedor, watching a little geometric caterpillar that was checking the number of inches between the two writers. "I did indeed. At first I wanted to write you a letter of thanks, with a touching reference to undeservingness and so on. But then I thought that this would not have introduced an intolerable human smell to the domain of free opinion, and besides, if I produced a good book, I should thank myself and not you. Just as you have to thank yourself and not me for understanding what was good. Isn't that true? If we start bowing up to one another, then as soon as one of us stops, other will feel hurt and depart in a huff." "I didn't expect truisms from you," said Kontchev with a smile. "Yes, all that is so. Once in my life, only once, I thanked a critic, and he replied, 'Well, as a matter of fact, I really liked your book,' and that really sobered me forever. By the way, I didn't say everything I could have said about you. You were so taken to task for non-existent defects that I no longer wanted to harp on these that were obvious to me. Furthermore, in your next work, you will either get rid of them, or they will develop into special virtues all your own, the way a speck on an embryo turns into an eye. You are a zoologist, aren't you?" "In a way, as an amateur. But what are those defects? I wonder if they coincide with the ones I know." "First, an excessive trust in words. It sometimes happens that your words, in order to introduce the necessary thought, to have smuggle it in. The sentence may be excellent, but still it is smuggling, and moreover gratuitous smuggling, since the lawful road is open, but your smugglers under the cover an obscure style, which all sorts of complicated contrivances import goods that are duty-free anyway. Secondly, there is a certain awkwardness in the reworking of the sources. You seem to be undecided whether to enforce your style upon the past speeches and events to make their own more salient. I took the trouble to confront one or more two passages in your book with the context in the complete edition of Shereshevsky's works, the same copy you must have used. I found your cigarette ash between the pages. Thirdly, you sometimes bring up a parody to such a degree of naturalness that it actually becomes a genuine serious thought, but on this level it suddenly falters, lapsing into a mannerism that is yours and not a parody of a mannerism, although it is precisely the kind of thing that you are ridiculing, as if somebody parodying an actor slovenly reading of Shakespeare had been carried away, so started to thunder in earnest, but had accidentally garbled a line. Fourthly, one observes in one or two of your translations something mechanical, if not automatic, which suggests you are pursuing your own advantage and taking the course you find easier. In one passage, for example, a mere pun serves as such a transition. Fifthly and finally, you sometimes say things chiefly calculated to prick your contemporaries, but any woman will tell you that nothing gets lost as easily as a hairpin, not to speak of the fact that the least swerve of fashion may make pins obsolete. Think how many sharp little objects have been dug up whose exact use not a single archaeologist can tell. The real writer would ignore all readers but one, that of the future, who in his turn is merely the author reflected in time. That, I think, is the sum of my complaints against you, and generally speaking, they are trivial. They are completely eclipsed by the brilliance of your achievements, about which I could still say fair a bit." "Oh, that is less interesting," said Fedor, who during this tirade, as Turgenev, Goncharov, Count Salius, Grigorovitch, and Boborkin used to write, had been nodding his head with an approving mien. "You diagnosed my shortcomings very well," he continued, "and they correspond to my own complaints against myself, although, of course, I put them in a different order. Some of the points run together, while the others are subdivided further. But besides the defects you have noticed in my book, I am aware of at least 3 more. They perhaps are the most important of all, only I'll never tell you them, and they won't be there in my next book. Do you want to talk about your poetry now?" "No, thank you, I'd rather not," said Kontchev fearfully. "I have reasons for thinking that you like my work, but I am organically averse to discussing it. When I was small, before sleep, I used to say a long and obscure prayer, which my dead mother, a pious and very unhappy woman, had taught me. She would have said that these 2 things are incompatible. But even so, it's true that happiness doesn't take the veil. I remembered this prayer and kept saying it for years until almost adolescence, but one day I probed it since, understood all the words, and as soon as I understood, I immediately forgot it, as if I had broken an unrestorable spell. It seems to me that the same thing might happen to my poems, that if I try to rationalize them, I shall instantly lose my ability to write them. You know, I corrupted your poetry long ago with words and meaning, and you will hardly continue writing verse now. You are too rich, too greedy. The muse's charm lies in her poverty." "You know, it's odd," said Fedor. "Once, about 3 years ago, I imagined most vividly a conversation with you on these subjects, and you know it came about somewhat similar, although of course you shamelessly played up to me and all that. The fact that I know you so well without knowing you makes me unbelievably happy, for that means there are unions in the world which don't depend at all on massive friendships, asinine affinities, or the spirit of the age, nor on any mystical organizations or associations of poets, where a dozen tightly knit mediocrities glow by their common efforts. At all events, I want to warn you," said Kontchev frankly, "not to flatter yourself as regards our similarity. You and I differ in many things. I have different tastes, different habits. Your fete, for instance, I can't stand, and on the other hand, I am an ardent admirer of the author of The Double and the Possessed, whom you are disposed to cite. There is much about you I don't like, your St. Petersburg style, your Gallic taint, your neo-Voltaireanism, and weakness for Flaubert, and I find, forgive me, your obscene, sporty nudity simply offensive, but with these reservations, it would be true probably to say that somewhere, not here but on another plane, whose angle, by the way, you have an even vaguer idea than I, somewhere on the outskirts of our existence, very far, very mysteriously and inexpressibly, a rather divine bond is growing between us. But perhaps you feel it to say all this because I praised your book in print. That also happens, you know." "Yes, I know. I thought of that myself, especially since formerly I used to envy your fame, but in all conscience—" "Fame?" interrupted Kontchev. "Don't make me laugh. Who knows my poems? 1,000, 1,500, at the very outside 2,000 intelligent expatriates, of whom, again, 90% don't understand them. 2,000 out of 3 million refugees. That's provincial success, but not fame. In the future, perhaps, I shall recoup, but a great deal of time will have to elapse before the Tungus and the Kalmuk of Pushkin's Exegi Monumentum begin to tear out each other's hands, my communication with the Finn looking enviously on." "But there is a comforting feeling," said Fedor meditatively. "One can borrow on the strength of the legacy. Doesn't it amuse you to imagine that one day, on this very spot on this lakeside, beneath this oak tree, a visiting dreamer will come and sit and imagine in his turn that you and I once sat here? And the historian will dryly tell him that we never took a walk together, that we were hardly acquainted at all, and if we did not meet, we only talked about routine trifles. But nevertheless try to experience that strange future retrospective thrill. All the little hairs on the soul stand on end. It would be a good thing in a journal to put an end to our barbaric perception of time. I find it particularly charming when people talk about the earth freezing in 1 trillion years and everything disappearing unless our printing shops are moved in good time to a neighboring star.